Hey everyone, Jeremy Boudinet here with Cam Prichard, CEO and founder of Spots Now. Cam, great to be chatting with you, man.
So good to be here.
How's your day going so far? How's life?
It's been fun. It's been fun.
Yeah, we've done a lot today. We filmed our first testimonial. We got after it. We're going for Spots Now.
Yeah, more shows on the platform. Everything's moving.
Love it. Love it, man. All right. So today we're going to talk about an important topic. As you guys know, Spots Now, the leader in podcast advertising, best place you can buy last minute spots on podcasts, get your tests running, get your brand out there. But we want to talk about the concept of YouTube ads versus podcast ads today, Cam. A lot of people are running YouTube ads. We want to kind of share how they're different than podcast ads, what to expect, what to do the same, what to do differently, all that good stuff.
Very hot topic and something that is a little bit confusing for advertisers. I mean, they both sound good, right? You get on YouTube, you get on podcasts, you kind of have an influencer. They're going out to a large audience. A few key distinctions that make the advertising channel very different. First off, when we talk about YouTube, we're talking about YouTube host-read advertising, not your programmatic AdSense YouTube where you just run pre-produced ads. So you're really talking about the value of influencer marketing here.
Yeah, I'm excited, man. So let's jump in. I want to talk first about kind of like what they share. So what are some commonalities you see between YouTube ads and podcast ads?
Well, first off, it's on-demand media. So when you run an ad, it's going to take you a while to actually see the results. Second, you've got an influencer that is typically going to do a host-read ad that is going to read out the specific ad that you have. So that's very similar. The other one is that you're going to put a promo code on both of them to track attribution.
So same principle, really. You're leaning on like the authenticity and the audience that a YouTube creator has, and you're doing the same with the podcast ad, right? Where the host has like a really good audience, the audience loves them, and you're leaning on them to really, deliver the value of your brand.
Exactly. And I think that the challenge here is that podcasting, some people think podcasts are YouTubers and they're very visual, but there's also podcasters that are very audio based. And so we're going to kind of, I guess, unpack both and think about what's good for who, when.
Love it, man. So let's talk about some like differences. Let's talk about like different tracking signals, things like that.
Yeah, well, first off, YouTube offers a visual screen, so you can now put advertising up in front of people's eyes. So that's very different, and that's very cool. On the other hand, people tend to have YouTube on in the background when they're cooking, etc. So they may not be as plugged in as you actually think, and it may not convert as well. Now, on the podcast side, when people listen to podcasts, they're doing housework, they're doing cleaning, they're in the car, they're commuting. And so a lot of the time they don't have their thumb on the screen either. So a few key challenges for both channels.
Yeah, it's very true. I'm a big podcast listener, by the way, and I also watch YouTube a lot, but I like to listen to YouTube actually. So I'm kind of like one of those guys where like I'd rather hear the ad than see it. So really cool, man. By the way, what are your favorite podcasts you listen to? What have you had anything work on you?
I've done the gamut, but I think, like I've even gone down true crime for a bit, but because we're working with a show, there was a true crime show, and I was like, I would never touch this category, but I got into it, and I was like, wow, this is pretty intense. It's kind of cool.
Yeah. I'm a big sports podcast guy, so I listen to like Bill Simmons, all guys like that, and I constantly hear, I feel like DraftKings ads where they're trying to get me to do sports betting, and I'm not gonna say it's pushed me over the top, but it might have. Let's put it that way, Cam. So let's talk like actual signals. So like we're both marketers, Cam, by trade. You were a marketer in your past life, becoming a founder. We know how important attribution is, right? So how are you tracking attribution with podcasts differently than what you're doing with YouTube?
I think here's the big distinction, right? Like with podcasts, you can stick an audio pixel onto your website and you can attribute actual sales from listeners of that very episode. Whereas on YouTube, you don't have that luxury. YouTube does not allow you to put those pixels in a YouTube video. And so what you find is savvy advertisers, they tend to start on podcasts first. They find people that they think are the right influencers for the audience they want to target, these audio pixels, and then they can see, look, I spent $1,000 and I got 5,000 back through these audio picks. And these are real big breakthrough in the last couple of years that have kind of changed the game in influencer advertising. So perfect way to start. Whereas with YouTube, you're basically reliant on tracking the clicks and promo code purchases.
Yeah, I remember when you told me, we talked to you when I was at Tesla, I was VP of growth, and we were exploring working with you guys. And you blew my mind with the audio pixels. I had no idea that technology was around now. So yeah, it's fascinating. Just the same way you can track attribute like a meta ad to a purchase, you can now do that with podcasts, which is crazy. Very cool, man. Anything else in terms of tracking signals that are useful, like branded search, things like that you think are
I think just like unpacking the tracking a little bit more, you've got a lot more that you can measure from podcast audio pixels, because most people, when they listen to content, if they hear a BetterHelp ad, they may not go and just click in the link in the show notes and go and, put in the code that they heard from a given ad, but they may go to Google search, 3 days later, put in BetterHelp and then go and get the service, for instance. And so that attribution is completely missed in YouTube. And there is some industry reports that say about 7 times the amount of attribution is missed because people don't have audio pixels, just because that's a very natural way of buying.
Yeah. So basically, long story short, must do audio pixels if you're doing podcast ads, right?
Yeah, without a doubt.
No brainer. Okay, let's talk about attention versus trust. So these are like the two things people think about, like, okay, first you have to get the buyer's attention, then you have to win their trust, and you have to convert them to action, right? So how do you differentiate between attention versus trust on YouTube and on podcasts?
Yeah, well, I think the more visually engaging an advert is on YouTube, you're going to hook people in. Whereas in podcasts, you're really going to win through a really strong personal experience in the middle of an episode where people are, they're halfway through their commute. They're in the New York subway. We know how stinky it is in there, but they're midway through an episode, and something comes on from their favorite host, and they have their thumb on the screen ready to go, or they remember it because it's a strong prompt. Whereas with YouTube, you kind of there's a lot of passive consumption, and so you really need to stand out and hook the listener. And there's a little bit of, I don't know what it's called in this world, but like I use the word banner blindness, where like back in the display days, when you put a banner up on a website, everyone would get used to it, and then they wouldn't, and then all of a sudden they would just start not seeing it because there was banners everywhere. And so same a little bit with YouTube, where, YouTube is naturally running a lot of ads, and then you get these host read ads as well. So they really need to stand out. So the hosts need to do a fantastic job to build that trust that a podcast would.
All right. So, Cam, when is it advantageous to advertise on YouTube versus advertising on a podcast? What are the strengths of each? We know not all channels are created equal. When should you choose one over the other?
Yeah, I really think that a little bit of show selection and category selection matters. So if you're a beauty product, then, like if there's some sort of like makeup YouTube video where people are actually teaching people how to do this, people are pretty glued to that screen. That's very powerful. And for you to be there at the right time with the right message is perfect. So anything visual is very powerful for sure with YouTube.
Got it. So basically, the more visual the product, the more it makes sense to advertise on YouTube versus podcasts. Whereas for podcasts, if visual's not as important, it's a much better channel, right? In terms of like costs and LTV and all that good stuff.
I think so. And I think like with YouTube, if you are going to go out to YouTube, you've got to understand that there is a lot of passive viewers. And so you got to pick shows where people are pretty glued to the screen. They're very engaged. So engagement becomes very important with YouTube. In fact, it's very important for both, for obvious reasons, because you need people to see the ad and be convinced. But certainly we want people that are, in their living room tops, like really dialed in.
And then one thing I want to touch on, because we explored YouTube ads when I was at Tesla. I worked for an influencer marketing agency. We did a lot of YouTube creators. And then I also talked to you, and we did podcast ad sort of pricing. And I was shocked actually that podcasts tend to be lower cost than YouTube, I feel like, in terms of working with the creators. So the creators have to create the content, the video, and all that good stuff. Whereas the podcasts, hosts just have to read it. So can you talk about like in terms of pricing, what's the difference like in terms of like you're spending money on a YouTube creator versus a host read ad?
YouTube can be super expensive. Yeah, it really can. But it can also convert like mad if you get it right. But the best option is to always start with audio first so you can figure out what those YouTube shows are that are actually worth doubling down on.
That's a great point that you can use your sort of podcast indicators. It's a lower cost test maybe, and then you can double down on the podcasts that are working and you can basically run that same playbook on YouTube, right? With the same types of creators.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe before we wrap up on this one other thing that is pretty powerful about YouTube is that the creators tend to pre-record the ads. So you actually get a full-on test version of what they're about to launch. This can be super helpful to make sure that everything's accurate, it's buttoned up, it feels like brand relevant, it feels like the CTA is locked in. Whereas with audio and podcasts, it's a little bit more on the fly. You kind of wake up one morning, the episode's gone out, and is it good or is it bad? And obviously at Spots now, we are making this a lot easier by providing really strong guidelines and systems to do air checks so we don't run into this. But this is a huge problem in the industry.
Any final thoughts for the listeners?
I think the final thoughts are pretty simple. Don't spend too much upfront to determine who the right influencers are to work with. Start with audio, expand to video, be really thoughtful and strategic, and dial up the dial once you have the formula.
Great stuff, man. All right. Thanks everyone for watching. We'll be back in another episode here, and check out Spots now. If you're leaning into podcast advertising, it is the best place to start with getting your podcast ads up and running, testing what works, and then doubling down your investments. Thanks, Cam.
Thank you.